The altar area had squared marble railings around it, which have been removed since then. Along the railings were kneelers, or rather red cushions that ran the length of the railing. This was for people to go up and kneel when the communion was being passed to them. Only older students and adults did that. I used to think of them as pigs lined up at the trough. There were a lot of places to kneel in that church, so there were kneelers here and there to let you know to do a lot of kneeling while you're there. They were padded kneelers too, to make it somewhat less painful, which confused me. The kneelers had padding, but the pews did not. The pews were solid wood and very flat. It was like sitting on two boards, one under you and one behind you. They were heavily varnished and very smooth, but unforgiving. Sometimes we'd find old gum on the underside of some pews. We dreamed of one day having the guts to chew gum in church, though. The altar was a very large white marble table, solid all throughout, and covered by a thin white tablecloth that only covered about 70% of it. This made the altar look larger. There are a lot of clever show tricks at work in the average Christian church. That altar was larger than some small cars of today. I wondered which was more difficult and time-consuming to bring into this church when it was built, the altar or the crucifix. Or maybe they were assembled where they stand. I wondered if God helped. Behind the altar is the most ominous crucifix I ever knew about in my youth. One of the few crucifixes in the church. A solid wood cross, smoothly polished and very well fitted together, and a solid wood Jesus nailed up to it. It's in the classic Catholic crucifix fashion, and it's larger than life. It's graphic and disturbing, and I always thought it was a terrible insult to Jesus. I would have been insulted if I was Jesus. But then if I was Jesus, well, that's a whole other book. To a child, such an image is like a branding iron on the sensibilities. We grew up with a healthy appreciation of violence and injustice thanks to that image, and the many other graphic images of the execution of Jesus. This Christian story was among their proudest. As I said, it was always somewhat dark in that church. There were no clear windows to the outside, only stained glass, and only a few of those. It let in a small amount of light, and this helped the church better control the lighting scheme inside. It also gave the feeling of a solemn place. A reverent attitude was a requirement of everyone who stepped foot in there, as was being sharply dressed. The dim lighting helped to reinforce the reverence. Going to church with my family was always very different from going to the same church during the week with my classmates. During school, when we went to church, which was once a week on Tuesdays, they packed us in there like sardines. We were all in uniforms, and they split us up by gender and crammed us into pews. It was one big, wiggly, snickering, smelly group, a sea of uniformed brats in a variety of ages and stages of immaturity. As adults, we need some physical space between us and other people most of the time. As a child, it's not so important, at least not in school. But in church, it seemed that to need and have personal space was an alien concept. When we went to Mass during the school day, we got physically closer than at any other time in the week. In church, we cut up and laughed and joked around, and we always got in some small amount of trouble. Our teacher would take us, and the whole school would be there together, led by several teachers. We were a real handful for them, too, and I was sure that they'd eventually give up on taking us to church. No such luck. Since half of the faculty were nuns, there were a lot of nuns among us when we were in Mass, so we behaved better there than elsewhere, even with all that cutting up still taking place. The nuns were quite strict and could see in all directions, it seemed. Still, it was hard to suspend a fun-loving attitude for a whole hour. Over the years, I learned how to sit still, stand still, kneel still, sing, and to hallucinate in a controlled manner. All from years of having to do that in church. Even though there was a lot to look at, after 30 minutes my young mind got bored, and I experienced sensory deprivation side effects, like minor visual hallucinations and dizziness. More about that later. Behind the giant crucifix there was a flat white wall. On the outside edges of that wall there were lights hidden from view that could be changed in a very effective way. The brightness of each light was controlled on a panel on the wall just to the right of the back wall, out of our view. I remember checking it out later in my time at Holy Ghost. The light panel had a series of dimmer knobs, and out of curiosity, one time when I was in the church with a couple of my buddies and no one else was in the church, I tried the dimmer knobs. They control the lights behind the cross and could be artfully arranged that way to have a different color and brightness scheme behind the cross for each Mass. I tried several combinations in a few seconds and then moved on. I immediately figured out another one of the church's show tools. It was very revealing. By the second grade, most of us young Catholics had received our first communion. I don't really remember my first communion, among the hundreds of times I went to church with my family. I'm sure I did well, though, because I didn't do so well a few times later on. Around the middle of the Mass is the time for what they like to call the Liturgy of the Eucharist. Basically, that's the part of the Mass dedicated to changing the wine and the host into the blood and the flesh of Jesus. Very nasty stuff. Transubstantiation, some people call it. Actually, they made it seem very clean and friendly. Take this and eat of it, all of you. It is the flesh of my flesh. Eat it and remember me, yada yada yada. It seemed more symbolic and metaphorical than what is suggested by the idea of a cannibalism ritual. But even as a kid, I knew what it was. They loved Jesus so much they wanted him inside of them, in a spiritual way. It's funny, they didn't spend much time teaching us about pagan rituals that happened before, during, and after Jesus did his pagan ritual, but later I learned that these acts are related to most ancient religions anyway. On Sundays, when families filled the pews, one family with kids was always selected and asked to bring the wine, hosts, and holy water to the altar for the liturgy of the Eucharist. One Sunday, my family was picked. We considered it a pretty nice honor. I was still quite young. They wanted kids to bring this stuff to the altar. Even though that stuff was really important stuff, they entrusted this special stuff in the hands of kids as young as 6 years of age. So my sister and I were asked, and we said okay. And we waited for the right time, and when that time came, we picked up these 2 silver plates with Eucharist items on them. One plate had a shiny brass covered bowl full of hosts, the little round white wafers, and sometimes they are made from rice, ironically enough. The other plate held the water and the wine. That's the one I got, and my sister carried the hosts. So there we were, all nicely dressed, my sister and I making our parents proud by taking this stuff down the altar, every congregant's eyes trained upon us. It was just my sister and I, like I said, no one else helped. And then there was a problem. The plate I was carrying wasn't exactly flat. It was slightly warped, so one of the small glass pitchers holding the water or the wine, I don't remember which, began to rattle on the plate. It made a rattling sound that could be heard all throughout the church, since there was a hush over the crowd at the time. I was trying my best to get this right and not spill anything and not trip and not die and go to hell before I got this stuff to the priest at the altar. So I had a thought and acted on it. I put a finger on the offending small glass pitcher and instantly solved the problem. No more rattling sound. The church regained its audible composure in total silence, and not a single laugh was heard. As we made our way to the altar, I looked at the priest staring at us, and he had a relieved smile on his face. And there I was, finally home free, so to speak. On the raised marble floor of the altar area, we gave our precious cargo to the priest, and he thanked us. And then he looked at me and quietly said, "I think you need to tie your shoes."